you don't find that text too despicable, you may be seated. Otherwise, give us about 20 minutes and we should be done. I'd say that this, of all of the gospel texts, is probably the least favorite of preachers. It is quite the puzzle. Puzzle maybe being the easiest word you might want to use. Scholars have written tons about this particular text, tying themselves in incredible knots, trying to make sense of this, trying to make a good thing for a congregation to take something home with so they can live their life a little more graciously, peacefully, sensibly, get some refreshment for the week, and this one just doesn't deliver at first glance. There are so many questions. First of all, is this recommending amoral behavior? I mean, you all know, as good heirs of the Protestant Reformation, we know that we don't get into heaven by doing good works, right? And you don't come here just to know how to be better people. You often pick that up along the way. You learn how to be more kind, gracious, and generous. But we don't come to church just to find out how to behave, right? You can get that everywhere. I mean, every news feed has at least one article on how you should be doing something better, even if it's hanging up your clothes. I mean, really. You come for the good news of the gospel, for some refreshment for the week. But this text seems to fly in the face of everything we believe about not cheating, being honest, giving your boss a good day's work for the wage you're receiving. So what is this about? And who is who in this story? Jesus has been telling a series of parables, and as every good seminarian learns, a parable has one point. One point. It's not an allegory where you have to put everybody in a particular box. I'm probably doing a little bit of each in this sermon because it's so tempting. But there is one point, and so we want to maybe ask, so who is this manager supposed to be representing? And who are we to emulate? Are we to do likewise? Or does those final verses about being faithful with the dishonest wealth, faithful in little and dishonest in a little, and what you do with the dishonest wealth and loving God and mammon, and you can't serve God and wealth. I mean, I will not have time to deal with all that. It's just too tightly packed. Hopefully your next rector will give you a Bible study on it, right? So you can get all the right answers. I can only touch on it briefly. But those are the questions we bring to this text. So I hope to deal with them in such a way that maybe you find something interesting and helpful. First, we've got to zoom out a little bit and get the context. I might have mentioned it the last time I was here that Jesus is on the way to Jerusalem. In the end of chapter 9, verse 51, we're told that he sets his face to go to Jerusalem. And a writer has said he sets his face like flint. He is bound and determined to get there. He's going there where he will be crucified. And he's not alone. He's got the disciples with him. He's got a whole passel of women. In Luke 8, Luke names specific women, some of them married to wealthy men, who followed after Jesus and provided for his means. And so I kind of imagine these women are, trailing behind, as would a good, women in a subservient culture do. And when Jesus and the boys go into a fast food, these women bring up the tail end and they poke their credit card in and pay for the whole lot, right? Well, these women, at the end, at the foot of the cross, we are told that these women are there, and they were the ones who followed Jesus from Galilee. So I presume they're along too. We also have the crowds who show up in these chapters. There's 10 chapters here until Jesus reaches Jerusalem. And then there are religious authorities who get rather crabby from time to time. Pharisees, scribes, and lawyers at various points. Not that all lawyers are crabby. I don't mean to impugn any vocation here. But these people, there's conversations going on. A lot of the material in these 10 chapters only occur in the Gospel of Luke. None of the others have them. Last Sunday's story of the Good Shepherd, we call him the Good Shepherd. That word good isn't there. Only in Luke. The one that follows it, the prodigal son, we didn't read that now. We read it last Lent. That's only in Luke. Today's story, only in Luke. But what Jesus is doing during these 10 chapters is he's trying to help people understand what it will mean to be in Jerusalem with him, what his dying and rising is going to mean. What will it mean for those who are following when he says, take up your cross and come and follow me? And therefore, what does it mean for us? That's the zoom out version of the context. If we zoom in a little closer, I think we have to look at last week's, well, it wasn't last week's lesson. It was in Lent, the prodigal son story. But both last week's and the prodigal has the line, so-and-so was lost and has now been found. But last week's story begins with a rich man, just as this one does. We have the young brother who wants his inheritance. He goes and he squanders it, squanders also in today's text. He ends up with pigs and their pods, and he has no friends. He goes home, throws himself on the mercy of his father, but he still doesn't have any friends because they're planning a big dinner party, and he has no friends anymore. His father and brother are outside arguing over whether the older brother even has to come in. So here the guy is alone with his party and all by himself, but no friends. So in today's text, Jesus begins then, or Luke begins then. I think it's not an accident that we need to hear this story today in the context of the whole prodigal story that he's just finished. So the story is this. There was a rich man, and he had a manager, and word comes that this manager is squandering his wealth. And so he calls in his manager and says, what are you doing? You have to give me an accounting. Now, what's interesting is that it's never established in this text whether those reports were true or not. I mean, they could have been lies. They could have been people who didn't like the manager and they wanted his job, and so they were going to do what they could to get him dismissed, right? There's no fact-finding commission on this at all. But he's going to lose his job. The manager decides he's going to go. And then, but the manager does something interesting. I don't know if I'm sure you've heard this, but when somebody who works either in television or radio is fired, they meet them at the door with their box full of their mugs and pens and papers. They don't let them go back on the air and say goodbye to everybody and, oh, by the way, just trash the management. That never happens. But this rich man says, okay, go get the books and give me an accounting. So the manager has time to cook the books, right? Is this rich guy dumb or what? Well, so the manager, who is a very shrewd person, clever, we're told, he sits down and one by one, he calls all the debtors in. First, I forgot something. I need to tell you about the tax system in that day and age. That was part of context, forgot it. So this is not a sermon against paying your IRS bills. In the society in which we live, our taxes pay for a lot of things that are good for our community. It helps people who have medical needs. It helps people who at the end of their life don't have enough money. It builds roads. It keeps bridges running, the water system. All of that is for the good of the community. But in Jesus' time, which was not a democracy, Rome ruled the world and the land of Palestine was a client state, there were layers upon layers upon layers of taxes, tolls, levies that were piled onto people. So the peasants in this story, and they were dirt poor peasants, probably had lost their land. That's what Jesus' family had lost its land. That's why he has to be a carpenter. You didn't go be a carpenter because you wanted to get into a nice cushy job with a trade union. Carpenters were like handyman. They had to roam around from town to town looking for work. That's what Jesus did. And if you were lucky, your family had been able to keep your family inheritance land. But these people haven't. And so they are renting, and the rent is paid not in money, because they didn't have much of that, but in oil, in wheat, in whatever they were growing. So they owed a certain amount to the manager in this case. But then there was a temple tax. All good Jews had to pay a temple tax. It went to Jerusalem to support that whole system. Oh, and then by the way, there was King Herod, who was kind of the local, small town, big whiz-bang guy. He needed his whole establishment paid for, and so that was layered on top. And then, oh, by the way, there was Rome, who had this huge army and was extending all over the then known world, and they needed money to feed and equip these. So the tax burden, it just goes heavier and heavier and heavier on very ordinary people. It was absolutely crushing debt. That's background, but do pay your taxes. Getting back to this manager, so he sits down and he calls each one in and he cuts their bill. And people sometimes say, well, he was cutting his commission, but that doesn't make much sense because he cuts by different percentages. Some very smart man who's done work in the Middle East figured this out, and he said he cuts each bill by 500 denarii. Now, a denarius was what a working bloke would make for one day. So that's over 500 work days. It's still a chunk of change that gets cut off. We have to fill in a few gaps here. So these people are getting this enormous break. Well, who would be giving it but the rich man, right? And the manager's the one who is passing along the word. And also the manager is not taking a cut of this. He passes it all along so that when they compare things at the end of the day, he called them in one by one, but they're going to be at the pub later on if they had money, and talking this over, right? And they all got the same 500 denarii cut. So, word gets out once the manager has finished this work. And the rich man laughs. He is delighted with what his manager did. He still loses his job, but he doesn't put him in jail, right? And jail in those days was a death sentence. And he laughs because now he has this great reputation in the community of being a generous man. And the manager also has a reputation so that when he's looking for a place to stay, people will welcome him into their homes. So that's the story. Who is the manager? I think it's Jesus. Jesus is the stand-in. And most scholars have wanted to avoid it, as have most preachers, which means they just have a terrible time making sense of the final verses. We don't like too much the notion that Jesus is a rule breaker, that he's somehow cheating the boss, that he's somehow cooking the books, that he's fooling around with interest rates and debt repayments. We don't like that too much. However, there are other places where Jesus breaks the rules, and we go, yay, Jesus, go, right on. And where are those places? Whenever he's breaking Jewish religious laws. Just a few weeks ago, he cured the woman who was bent over double. He says she has been bent for 18 years. I'm not waiting till the day after the Sabbath. She should not wait one more day. And he cures on the Sabbath, and they grumble and mumble at him. The guy who had a crooked hand, and so that left him outside a community, Jesus cures him on the Sabbath because he shouldn't have to wait one more day. The bleeding woman touches Jesus, and he turns to her and says, your faith has saved you. Her touching him gave him cooties, religious cooties, and he had to be outside the community for a bit. He touches dead people. The little girl who had died, and there's a story of raising a son of the widow of Nain. Jesus touches the bier. That touching a dead body makes him unclean. It puts him outside of community. And he ate with tax collectors and sinners. And all the religious people are just cranking around all over the place. But why don't we get upset with that? Well, it's not our religion, right? That's the old covenant. We're people of the new covenant. We're just glad that Jesus is smashing all that stuff because it doesn't matter anyway, and it probably didn't matter then. But you go, Jesus. You go ahead and break all those rules. And why did he do it? To bring people back into community, because people were hurting. All of those diseases, whether mental or physical, leaving them outside a community, and he cared enough for people that he wanted to restore them to community so they could stand up straight and take their place in society. What if we decide, or try on, that maybe Jesus was doing that in this particular text? That this is not just a story, but maybe Jesus was doing something to try to affect the huge crushing tax burden that people had in his day. We know he ate with tax collectors, and they complained to him because they were handling dirty money, right? It had pictures of Caesar on it. That meant they were idolaters. You weren't supposed to touch a graven image, and there was Caesar, and they had all the tax collectors were caught in that system. Did they take advantage? Of course they did, but they were also caught in the system. And Jesus went to dinner with them. And I wondered, was Jesus just saying, look at me, I'm the lover of humanity, I am choosing to bring you into my presence and accept you? Yeah, but I wonder if he maybe did something else, like say, okay guys, I get around. I'm going from village to village, building one thing or another, and I see how these people are living. Some of them are so poor, it makes them sick, and I'm a healer, and I don't like this stuff, right? You think you could figure out a way to give them a break occasionally? I mean, you don't have to leave your profession. Just can you find a few ways that they can get a little bit of kindness? I think Jesus might have been saying that. And one of the things that fuels that impression that I got, by the way, I haven't just done this, I've done a lot of reading. Other people have thought this before me. I'm just compiling it. But not this part. In 3 chapters, Jesus is in Jericho, Luke 19, and it's his last stop before he goes up that crooked hill, 17 miles to Jerusalem. It's a very steep, windy road. And he comes into town, and there's this buzz going on that this guy from Galilee is down here, and people are talking. And there's this chief tax collector named Zacchaeus, and he wants to see this Jesus. So he climbs up in a sycamore tree because he's so short he can't see him. And Jesus comes by and he says, Zacchaeus, get down here. I'm going to eat at your house today. And Zacchaeus scrambles on down and he says, and of course everybody's grumbling, right? They say, look who he's gone home to dinner with. Not the good religious folks. He's going home with a tax collector, and not just any tax collector. Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector. He's probably the one that started the Facebook group for tax collectors. And by means of this device, word had spread. And so Zacchaeus comes down, and as they start out, the text says, Zacchaeus stood there, as if he first had to stop and declare his intention. And then he tells Jesus how his plan for repayment, 4 times here and whatever, if I've ever defrauded, I'm going to pay back. He's got this all worked out. And he's just now seen Jesus for the first time. Where did he get these ideas? I think word had been spreading because Jesus had been saying to these tax collectors, while also welcoming them, said, give these folks a break. And so when Jesus gets to Jerusalem and they haul him before Pilate, what do they say? This guy was forbidding us to pay taxes to Caesar. He gets hauled up on those charges. I think that's what we've got going on here. That this Jesus is a rule breaker and by whatever means possible was giving these people a break. Now you may all find that ridiculous, silly, heretical. It doesn't matter. My job is to give you some good news here today, not just explain a Bible text. The single point of this gospel lesson is to make friends for yourselves by whatever means necessary. And if you have to use filthy lucre, as it's called in one of the epistles, go ahead and do it. If you have to make friends by breaking some religious laws, go ahead and do it. St. Paul says at some point that Jesus came to break down the enmity between God and us, between human being and human being, even within our own souls and with the enmity that we have for creation. He came to break down enmity and to bring peace. That is his mission. And so these final verses, just to pick up on a couple, he was faithful in a little bit by giving the tax collectors. It was a small thing because it didn't relieve the entire tax burden, but it gave him a break. But it was a relatively little thing. But he was faithful. And the big thing he was faithful in, he didn't run from the cross. Like Horton the elephant, he was faithful 100%, and he stayed, and he saw it through. And God raised him up from the dead on the other side. Luke's big message is peace. And so Jesus says in this parable, make friends however you can. Bring peace among your community. How do we bring peace? Well, we give each other breaks. We forgive each other, which often is giving somebody a break, right? And so in that way, this text, I think, brings us closer to the kind of work he was doing, but also the huge gift we get. We get his friendship. In John's gospel, Jesus calls them, I've called you friends. He chooses to become our friend. And by doing that, he enables us then to make friends with one another, to live in community that is working towards peace and finding more and more ways to care for one another and to be generous people. But it's not that we gotta. It's not one of these. This is the huge gift you've been given. So revel in it. And out of that energy and that sense of peace, you too are able to live this way in the world. Amen.